Hello buddy, yeah, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list. Now this time around we are going to be covering the Dawi, and the Dawi are in my opinion one of the more interesting factions in the game right now, and for a lot of the wrong reasons. Now back in Warhammer, the days of Warhammer 1, they were basically a joke. They were widely considered the worst faction in the entire game. They were simply way too easy to bully through a variety of methods. Now, they have evolved from that. Dwarves right now are actually a rather competitive race. There is no matchup, really, that the Dwarves have, not even Skaven, that is really unwinnable. At the same time, there are no matchups where I think the Dwarves have a completely undefeatable advantage. However, Dwarves are still in a rather bad spot. And the reason for that really boils down to the viable strategies Dwarves have. Certain Dwarf units are simply overtuned, essentially, to compensate for the Dwarves' inability to really properly deal with units like chariots, to really deal with units like big monsters, or large flyers and units like that. So as a result, Dwarves do have a significant contingent of very cost-effective infantry as well as missile units. If one compares the stats on much of the Dwarven shooting roster or even melee infantry roster compared to other similarly priced units, it is relatively difficult to argue otherwise. But Dwarves are essentially stuck in a perpetual loop of Dwarven. The only really viable Dwarven builds are essentially onions, either a Vanguard onion or a backline camping onion with artillery. And as a result, your opponent has to commit to extreme strats to break these onion builds. And this in turn means that the Dawi do not really have room to experiment with a lot of their roster. Much of the roster, especially the melee infantry, is simply not particularly, or I should say higher end melee infantry, is simply not viable. Much of the elite artillery is simply not viable because the Dawi do not really have the means to protect or make use of this artillery. The fact that the Dawi cannot afford to lose artillery duels, or do not really have ways to shut down enemy artillery, forces them to make certain choices when they're making their builds. And we will discuss that as we go through the roster. I think it will impact a lot of the tierings here. Essentially, their current Lord choice is the Lord of Choice is completely dictated by this Dwarven meta, and the Dwarven needs to deal with very specific targets, which are, of course, large monsters, large single entities, chariots, units like that. These units that traditionally have bullied the Dawi pretty heavily. Now, there have been various proposals to fix this issue. There have been, we will see if CA sort of goes around and tries to fix it. That said, Dwarves are competitive, certainly. They're not, like I said, not necessarily overpowered or under-tuned, but just in a bad spot, in my opinion. But without further ado, let's kind of dive in, break their roster down, and see where everything falls. So first and foremost, we are going to start with the High King. And the High King is going to get himself a D tier. And in fact, this is going to be a bit of a repetition here with the Dwarf roster. Now, why is Thorgrim a D tier? On paper, he's actually a rather good lord. He has very high combat stats. He doesn't have AP on his melee damage, but he does do magic damage, which allows him to counteract the ethereal units that dwarves do struggle with. Dwarves do not have much in the way of AP damage, or magic damage. Sorry, they only have Thorgrim, Grombrindle, and Gotrek, and then their ghost lords, or ghost heroes, I should say, from Clan Angrid. And finally, the Peak Gate Guard. Those are your options as dwarves if you need to deal magic damage. So this is very limiting, obviously, and so Thorgrim being able to fulfill that role is definitely nifty. He also has some great AoE buffs. He does have the Book of Grudges, which grants +9 melee attack to all nearby units. Pretty hefty buff. He does have a melee defense debuff with the Oath of Vengeance, and it's actually got a very low cooldown. It synergizes incredibly well with units such as Hammerers. The problem is that due to the fact that dwarves are a faction built around countering cavalry and monsters, most Dwarven builds do not rely on elite infantry. The units that would really benefit from Thorgrim's buffs and debuffs the most. And this hurts Thorgrim a lot. Thorgrim also doesn't bring any really crowd control or utility to the army in that sense, and he is rather expensive. He does have a hefty price tag, I believe over 2,000 if you bring him with the full kit, and this is definitely not ideal for a Lord who's very immobile. Now, granted, unlike other Dwarf Lords, he cannot be knocked over due to the fact that he is being carried around by the shield carriers and counts as a large target. But this, in turn, does make him an easier target for enemy missile play, makes him an easier target for enemy Lord sniping in some ways. So despite his FTH people, despite his respectable combat stats, he just doesn't bring what the Dwarves really need to the table. And that puts him at D tier. You can use him in niche builds. He's certainly not completely unviable. For all the Lords that are going to fall in the lower tiers here, you can compensate in large part for their inadequate stats with the help of Rune Lords or Rune Smiths. Or I should say Rune Smiths, really. But, yeah. They are simply not that great. Next up, Crazy Uncle Gromby, and this is going to be a B tier. Now, Gromby, in my opinion, brings more to the table that the Dawi need than Thorgrim does. He still brings magic damage, which is great. Like we mentioned, Dwarves struggle with that. His items, not the best. Rune Helm of Zufbar, as well as Grumbrindle, the Axe of Grumbrindle, not that great. Yes, Discouraged effect is nice and all, but ultimately, as the Dwarves, you're usually either breaking your opponent with missile play, or just grinding them down, and being able to sort of chase off one chaff unit, which is likely where Grumbrindle's going to end up getting stuck at some point, is just not that valuable most of the time, and it's just not worth investing your money in over more missile units or more infantry zoning tools and that sort of thing. Besides the end, of course, leadership from the Rune Helm of Zufbar for Dwarves, who are one of the best leadership factions in the entire game, that is not that valuable either. Besides that, though, he does have the Flash Bomb, which is very good. That is really the thing that bumps him up to B tier. The fact that he brings crowd control in an AoE is definitely useful. It does come with its own built-in melee defense debuff, so you can use it offensively if you happen to have run into a more melee-centric infantry, or if you're running a more melee-centric infantry build. Gromby can synergize pretty well there as well. He's not necessarily up to snuff with the Rune Lord. He's not quite up there, but still a rather competitive Lord choice. And he does also have Grumbrindle Has No Fear, which is a very useful, in my opinion, ability. Single use, map wide, unbreakable. Oftentimes in certain matchups, you will see that an opponent will go hard in the paint to snipe out certain elite missile options that the Dwarves bring. So, for example, they'll try to snipe out your organ guns. If they're playing as Bretonia, they might dive you with hippogriffs, or they'll try to snipe out Iron Drakes with troll hammers, whatever. And Dorman leadership, while very good, will eventually break. So the fact that you can pop Unbreakable, keep all these units in the fight, prevent them from routing out of the box and getting chased off the field, can be huge. That can be game-changing. That can decide an entire match. And in my opinion, it is enough to bump Gromby up to a B tier, which makes him, spoiler alert, I suppose, the highest rated, in my opinion, legendary Lord in the Dwarf roster. Now, next up, we do have the Angry Slayer Man. Ungrim also nets himself a D tier. His main gimmick is that he's unbreakable, which is Dwarves isn't that valuable. He's realistically, you're usually not getting Lord Snipe as Dwarves because your opponent's priorities is your opponent's going to be hell-bent on sniping out your artillery and your missile play, not your Lords. So Ungrim being unbreakable is not that valuable. He's can hit pretty hard, but Red Ruin, which is his ability that boosts his damage output, comes with a massive drop in melee defense that's already not that good. I believe he's at 40 still. So Red Ruin drops that to practically 0. And I believe it drops to 13. And it's really kind of can be counterproductive, especially if you're fighting in a mob of infantry. It can actually mean that Ungrim takes way more damage than you'd like. He can certainly provide some additional damage output. He can certainly provide a sort of threat for your opponent to consider and be wary of. But at the same time, he doesn't really bring utility to the army. He is simply an unbreakable Lord choice that can do damage under ideal circumstances. But I don't think he's worthwhile in most situations. And he's just netting himself a D tier. Next up, we do have Belegar Ironhammer, if I can find him. And Belegar is Mr. Revenge Incarnate. And he is also going to net himself a D tier. And the reason for that is quite simple. Belegar is just not that good. He's a tank. He's got Silver Shield. He's got the Mighty Oathstone, which is essentially a better stand your ground. It gives you expert charge defense as well as a bonus to melee defense of 27, much like all other stand your ground. Actually, at this point, it's lower. It got nerfed, so it's 24, but still, it gives you a bonus to your melee defense. So, you know, that's great. That is definitely a tangible buff. He does have Revenge Incarnate, which boosts his melee damage by a significant margin. Unfortunately, he's non-AP, and he is slow as all heck, so it doesn't actually prove that useful. A lot of the time, what I see is that if people bring Belegar, they bring him completely stripped naked, and he's just a budget tank choice. Unfortunately, if you're going to do that, you might as well bring a stripped down Rune Lord or even a stripped down Dwarf Lord. So that definitely constrains how much value Belegar nets. He's essentially your dirt cheap tank option, and dwarves have other options for dirt cheap, decent tank. There really isn't any Dwarf Lord that's actually squishy. So while Belegar is tankier than probably all of them, it is not enough of a boon, in my opinion, to compensate. Next up, we do have the Vanilla Dwarf Lord. This guy's also a D tier. He's basically a budget Belegar. There isn't much else to say. He does have Perfect Vigor with an item if you want to kit him out. He can provide an AoE melee attack debuff. Once again, can help a little bit. Is it worth it? Probably not. Really, you're going to bring this guy as an absolute dirt cheap budget option so that you can get more width with the rest of your army, so that you can get more guns, so that you can get more snares with Rune Smiths, so that you can get an extra unit here and there. That's really why you're bringing a Lord. But realistically, this guy's just not that valuable because the best boy is the Rune Lord, and the Rune Lord is an easy S tier. And this kind of shows that the dwarves are really centered around one playstyle, and this sums it up. Rune Lord is essentially the lord that keeps dwarves. Rune Lord and Rune Smiths are really the heroes and lords that keep the dwarf faction afloat in many matchups. Prevent them from being overly abused by chariot play and mobile unit, monstrous unit play, that sort of thing. The Rune Lord providing a 72% speed debuff with the Rune of Wrath and Ruin is insanely valuable for that. Previously, the speed debuff was lower. It was 48% with the... was previously 48% with an added benefit of doing damage. Now it doesn't do any damage, it simply snares. So a very strong debuff, certainly. You can slow your opponent to crawl, make them very easy to shoot down. Besides that, the other runes are not terrible. Rune of Oath and Steel, bit situational. You got to be predicting that your opponent's going to bring some non-AP. Maybe if you're going against a faction like Lizardmen, who tend to bring a lot of non-AP in this matchup, Rune of Oath and Steel can be decent. Then you've got the Rune of Mastery of Negation. Great, gives you AoE not melee defense. It gives you AoE ward safe of 44%. Not for a long time. I believe it only lasts 18 seconds off the top of my head, but you know, 18 seconds of 44% ward safe is still pretty bonkers. The guy also does have the Gatekeeper's Belt, which isn't terrible. Grants you 33% ward safe when you are below a third of your HP. Not bad by any means. Can actually make this guy quite a beast. And actually, if you've got him on his toilet seat, he becomes nearly invulnerable to a lot of forms of attack. It's actually pretty gross. He also does have the Mastery of Grumbling, which grants an AoE missile to resist. This is going to be great in matchups where you're expecting your opponent to go heavy in missile play, and it can help you counter battery your opponent. It can help your cannons hold out a bit longer. Finally, he does have the toilet seat, as I like to call it, or the Anvil of Doom. This grants him an additional 15% magic resist, as well as an additional 15% magic resist to all units in the Dwarf army. Pretty insane. I actually think it gives him more than that in magic resist, but it gives your whole army 40% magic resist, essentially, because you got your baseline 25, 15% on top of that. At that point, your dwarves can shrug off a lot of magic. So a pretty insane boost there. Helps make your cannons more resistant if you're worried about your opponent trying to snipe you with fireballs, that sort of thing. You can actually camp your Rune Lord next to your cannons with the Master of Grony, as well as having the Anvil of Doom, and that will actually, I believe, is enough to make your cannons immune to instant death by fireball, which is a tangible benefit if you're playing against a faction where you're worried about that happening. What else is there for this guy? His Rune of Arthen Home, not the greatest thing. His rune that grants additional 10% AP damage, not the greatest thing either. It's really not that strong. Once again, Dwarven builds are not really built around melee, and Dwarven leadership is very good, so Immunity Psychology is not that valuable. But by and large, this guy's great. He brings crowd control. That's the biggest selling point of this guy. That's what you really need to know. And that's why he's S tier. He's cheap, brings crowd control, plus has a bunch of additional utilities. So just an insanely strong lord. He'd be a rather strong lord in any roster, to be quite honest. But in the Dwarf roster, especially with its limitations, he is an easy S tier. Now, moving on into heroes, this is where things get a little hairy. The dwarf, well, I say they've already gotten hairy with the lords. With the heroes, it's arguably just as bad. And we are including the Agarn heroes here, and what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to simply do the generic version and then the Agarn version and bounce back and forth that way. So first and foremost, the Thane, easy F tier. And his two buddies here, the Ghosty Boys, landed themselves in F tier as well. Why, you might ask? Because they suck. The Thane with Tormentor Sword back in the day used to be a pretty solid backline defense. Now, the Thane is incredibly limited. His combat stats are decent, but it doesn't matter because he's not really able to get on a target. He's essentially a budget version of a Dwarf Lord, except you're not forced to bring a Lord, or Thane. You are forced to bring a Lord, so Thane's just not that good. His items are all incredibly situational. He's got a Fire Weakening Rune in an AoE, which synergizes with Iron Drakes and Flame Cannons, except that's incredibly situational and niche. He's got a Rune of Slowness, which slows enemies by 18%, which is nowhere near enough to make it valuable. So he can't really crowd control very well. And he's got a rune that boosts charge bonus in an AoE, except as dwarves, you're not really looking to play that melee game, so it doesn't really matter. Plus, bring this guy just to get your troops an extra 12 charge bonus is really not worthwhile, in my opinion. Thorgrim to get that extra melee, get those extra hits in with the melee defense debuff, get that extra melee attack, all that I can understand, but I think a Thane for the extra 12 charge bonus just is not worthwhile. And his cost does start to spike. Essentially the same thing since the Ghost versions. The Ghost versions are just 500 gold more expensive, which is obscene. They do cause fear and terror, and of course they do have physical resist rather than armor. But ultimately they're telegraphed very heavily by the fact that you pick Clan Agarn. What I will say, there is one benefit to the Ghost characters, and that is that you can force your opponent to bring magic to counteract. Especially if it's a roster that doesn't have good access to magic damage, you can force your opponent to bring a lore of magic that causes direct damage. So you can force an opponent to bring Spirit Leech, and for example, they might not want to bring Lore of Death. Lore of Death isn't necessarily the strongest against dwarves, so the fact that you can force that out of your opponent is nifty because it's so heavily telegraphed by picking Agarn. Your opponent is anticipating you to bring Ghost Lads, but in reality you don't do it. So that's really the biggest benefit of the different Ghost heroes. But practically speaking, these guys are they're not really any better functionally than the Thane. And if you are going to bring any Ghost hero, you are going to bring these other guys. They still bring Fear and Terror to the field. They're still unbreakable. Their combat stats aren't as good, but that just doesn't matter that much. Honestly, if these guys did cause AP damage like most other ethereal units do, I could actually see them having some niche, but because they don't, it's just kind of meh. Why bother? And it's telegraphed so heavily that your opponent is going to have some sort of counterplay available. And as dwarves, you don't have healing, so keeping ethereal units in the fray is difficult. Next up, we do have the, I guess it should be the Rune Smith, but we'll cover the Master Engineer because there isn't much to say for this guy. Master Engineer is not as terrible, I will say, as the Thane. He certainly has minor niche applications. I'm going to give him a C tier, which might be a little generous. I will give his ethereal variant a D tier. The reason for that is simple. His AoE buffs to artillery are solid. Entrenchment is decent if applied really to infantry. You actually don't usually want to use on artillery. It can help artillery. It can help actually boost your cannons to be able to insta-gib some monsters infantry and whatnot. But entrenchment prevents your own units from moving, which is an issue. The problem with this guy really is that he costs a lot to buff your artillery, and in many cases you could bring an extra unit of shooting, or maybe even 2 extra units of missiles, for the price of an engineer. And you got to debate whether or not that is worth it. Now, the engineer himself is a character who can fight. He's not terrible in melee. He is okay in range damage. He will do some decent poke over time. He actually has piercing shots. I believe there was actually a recent Milk and Cookies video, and he was running the Master Engineer against Dark Elves. He can certainly contribute to the fight. Don't get me wrong. That is why he's C tier. He's not terrible. He does buff the dwarves' strongest suit. But ultimately, do you want to invest in this guy? In most cases, probably not. And the ethereal version is just much more expensive. He does, once again, he's got better resilience against non-magic attacks. He's got better He's got Fear and Terror, but I just don't think it's as valuable. As dwarves, you really want to go cheap on the heroes and lords, and the core of your army is going to be cheap infantry and shooting in most cases. And so paying extra for an ethereal, especially when it's so heavily telegraphed, is not that great. Finally, the Rune Smith, and this bad boy is an S tier hero. If you're not bringing a Rune Lord, you are probably bringing a Rune Smith. It's almost guaranteed. If you're bringing a Rune Lord, you're quite possibly bringing a Rune Smith, additionally. This guy brings crowd control. He's got a budget version of all the Rune Lord's abilities. He also has the Hammer of Characteras, which is a great melee attack and weapon strength debuff that you can apply to your opponents. Stack this on decent tankiness and a relatively cheap base price of, I believe, 550. And this guy's not terrible. Even with, and you don't have to bring all his runes. You can just bring like a Rune of Wrath and Rune for crowd control, and then bring a like a Hammer of Characteras for that melee attack and defense and weapon strength debuff. Great items. This guy can be used to stiffen up your front line. All in all, just a great hero. Top tier for the Dawi. Really props up a lot of their builds and is absolutely critical for him. Arguably even more critical than the Rune Lord, because you will basically never see a build without a Rune Smith. Whereas you will see builds, very rarely, but you will occasionally see builds without a Rune Lord. So that is the Dawi. The Ghost Engineer, or the Ghost Runesmith, I'm going to give a C tier to. He's still so much more expensive that it hurts a lot. I do think he's better because he's a Runesmith, but it's telegraphed so heavily by the fact that you have to go Agarn to get this guy. He's not really better than the Runesmith. He is a little tankier against most things, but is it really worth it? No, probably not. You're probably better just shaving off that I think there's a 450 gold difference between these two. You're probably better off saving that money, getting another unit of Dwarf Warriors, and yeah. But then again, he does bring Fear and Terror to the field, and if you're going to bring any Ghost hero, this guy's probably the best way to go, just because he brings all the utility of a Runesmith. Finally, we do have our true legendary heroes, and that is Felix and Gotrek. And these guys are quite disgusting for the dwarves. I'm going to give them an A tier, though, not an S. I don't think they are always the best choice. I think there are certain matchups where they just do not shine that well. But in my opinion, Felix and Gotrek are really bad to deal with when they were the dwarves. I think the dwarves and Empire are factions that are well kitted out to kill the units that threaten these two. Felix, Gotrek, and your Lord can essentially sit somewhere camping away while Felix heals everybody, and it can be very difficult to snuff Felix out. Whereas with other factions, sniping Felix, whereas if you're fighting against Bretonnia, for example, it's not necessarily that hard to isolate and snipe Felix, especially because their infantry is just, most other factions, or Bretonnia's infantry is just so terrible. It's not that hard to isolate him. You can afford to risk monsters and all sorts of stuff like that against Bretonnia to cycle charge these guys into oblivion. So Felix and Gotrek are not as powerful in that matchup, but with the dwarves and the Empire, who are able to just shut down the majority of the threats to these two, you can find yourself in late game situations where the majority of your opponent's army is just infantry, and Felix, Gotrek, and your Lord can essentially just mow through those for days. And it is quite a disgusting thing to deal with. The heals Felix provides are just ridiculous. They are probably a bit undercosted, I would argue. I think that really the biggest problem is simply the fact that Dwarf Roster is so well designed to shut down the units that normally would threaten these two. And it's very, very frustrating and unfun to play against, to be quite frank with you guys. I really do hate playing against Felix and Gotrek. And I think it's bad for in the case of Empire as well. I think Bretonnia is the one faction where these guys are actually reasonably balanced. But that is it for these guys. I don't think they're great in every matchup. There are certain matchups where I think these guys still do take up money that could be better spent on Runesmiths for crowd control, that could be better spent on shooting. There is certainly counterplay, but they are very good. And I think against certain factions, they can get absolutely oppressive. So, yeah, easy A. Now we're moving on to infantry. And here it's quite a medley of different troop types. Some that are actually really valuable, some that are, well, not quite so valuable. So, miners, yeah, great unit, honestly. Dirt cheap, not great in combat. They lose to basically everything in their price range. The fact they do AP damage and melee, it makes them trade okay into some higher end troops that would mulch other chaff. They'll still mulch these guys, just not without taking some damage. Plus, their relatively high leadership and armor makes them okay tank and surviving despite bad melee defense. But they're really the key to these guys is the fact they're cheap and can allow you to generate a lot of width. However, they do compete in this role with other dwarf units. There's really and that is the reason they're going to land themselves a B tier. Different dwarf builds will approach this, will approach how to generate width differently. I'm personally very fond of miners, but I know a lot of dwarf players, and honestly, a lot of dwarf players that are significantly better than me are not as fond of miners as I am. So I'm going to give them a B tier. I think that is a fair place to put them. Miners with blasting charges, I'm going to give them an A tier. Blasting charges single-handedly screw with certain matchups very badly. The blasting charges can destroy even relatively expensive infantry or cause disproportionate damage to them. And they will really mess up squishy infantry. And makes it very easy for the miners to recoup their cost unless your opponent gets a unit in to disrupt these guys first. So for that, these guys are going to net themselves an A tier. I think there's more matchups where you will want some miners with blasting charges than the ones where you want just generic miners. But certainly both units are units that allow you to get more width. Then moving on into the proper Dorman Infantry, we have Dwarf Warriors. These guys are not bad. I'm going to give them an A tier again. And really the reason these guys are not higher on the list is because they overlap and compete with so much on the Dwarf roster. And actually our next... Well, actually not quite our next, but some of our next infantry is once again competing with these guys. So Dwarf Warriors, great way to generate additional width. They will trash essentially every infantry that's like 500 gold and under. I'm not sure if they lose to Marauders with great weapons. Maybe that's something I should have tested before this tier list, but honestly, they basically beat everything that's in their price range. They're really brutally efficient. They do also have charge defense against large. They do have bronze shields. They can just hold for a very long time. Even against elite units, the fact that they have 40 melee defense means that they can be a sturdy bulwark that holds for a very long time. Now, granted, their leadership is, while good, is not necessarily the best, so they can certainly be broken. They are certainly not going to fight to the bitter end like some other units on the Dwarf roster, but very difficult to deal with nonetheless for certain factions, for certain units. And where miners will get beaten by essentially every unit in their price range, these guys will essentially beat everything in their price range and below. So, Dwarf Warriors, very strong unit. Easy A. And really, it would be leaning towards S if I didn't feel that there are certain situations where like miners or Longbeards, when we get to them, are a little bit better. Actually, you know what? Dwarf Warriors will get an S because I think that you'll find Dwarf Warriors in just about every Dwarf build. You'll find them in almost every, if not every, Dwarf build. Next up, Dwarf Warriors with great weapons. I think this is the most viable of the Dwarven great weapon units, but they are not great. Their melee attack is very bad, which is kind of underwhelming for a unit that's supposed to be a great weapon unit, a unit that where really its primary purpose is dishing out damage. These guys do have passable melee defense of 30, but melee attack I believe is 24. It might just be 22 off the top of my head. And so that is very limiting. They also cost more than Dwarf Warriors, and they don't get shields. So yeah, kind of a restrictive feature there. Now there are certain niche situations where they work rather well. The fact that they bring AP damage to the table means you can catch opponents by surprise. It means if you're expecting heavy cav, these guys can dish out additional hurt. They do have decent weapon strength and AP, so you know, against Bretonnian knights, they'll do some decent work. Really against any cavalry, I think that's really the key purpose of Dwarf Great Weapons, is that they double up as a decent anti-infantry tool, while actually being able to hit back against, especially cavalry, heavy cav. But realistically, I think these guys don't deserve above a C tier. You're not going to be running Great Weapon lines in most Dawi builds, because you're going to be looking to get these Vanguard, or you're going to be looking to either get these Vanguard options, or you're playing defensive. And I actually should say that is a situation where you will not use Dwarf Warriors. I'm still going to leave them at S tier because I think they are really good. But if you're doing a Vanguard build with the Dawi, Dwarf Warriors are not really a great option. In that case, miners are going to be your bread and butter. But I still think Dwarf Warriors deserve an S. Because realistically, Vanguard builds are not that popular for Dwarves. Even though it is the most common alternative to Pure Onion. Moving on, we do move on into the realm of Longbeards. Longbeard's a stellar unit that has been nerfed I'm very much wavering between A and S. The fact that they got a nerf recently, which did hike up their price, makes me want to lean towards A. At the same time, they are still a unit you will see in practically every matchup, so I'm going to give them an S. Outside of Vanguard builds, you're going to see Longbeards all the time. Immune to psychology, solid melee defense, charge defense against large, passable offensive stats, 100 armor, stellar leadership. These guys are borderline unbreakable in a lot of situations. Just a really, really good unit. They will trade relatively well into most, well, basically into any lightly armored infantry, and they'll even trade pretty well into a lot of slightly more expensive non-AP infantry. Units like Saurus and whatnot, while not winning against Longbeards, will not trade super efficiently into them. So Longbeards certainly are a very strong force. And what the heck? I'm going to move Miners with Blasting Charges up here with these guys, because this is really their holy or unholy trifecta of infantry for the Dawi. But Longbeard's very, very strong. Very, very strong unit. And you'll see them in almost every Dawi build. Longbeard Great Weapons, less amazing. I think I'm also going to give them a C tier. In certain matchups, they can let you... These guys won't necessarily beat enemy Great Weapons, but they can go toe-to-toe with some of them, especially some of the cheaper ones. So against like Empire Great Swords or Bretonnian Foot Squires or units like that, these guys will trade okay with those units. They do have that AP once again to help deal with cavalry a little bit. They do, or I mean psychology. They have all the benefits of being Longbeards, plus the fact that the Longbeards have gone up in price, I think has made these guys a little bit more appealing as an alternative. I still don't think that you're going to bring these guys in the majority of situations, but I think a C tier is pretty fair. From there, we do move on into the realm of Slayers, if I can find them. So Slayers, I'm going to give Slayers a B tier. Slayers are good, but they're not a mandatory pick. If you're going to bring Slayers, you're going to bring the Regiment of Renown. That's basically a guaranteed. It's almost an auto lock. That's one of the best Dwarf units. Slayers are definitely respectable. They do provide you with some backline defense. They provide you with some flexibility. They can mow through cheap infantry pretty quick, despite not being meant for it. But they are very susceptible to enemy missile play. Certainly not a unit you're going to see in every build. But definitely a solid option for the Dwarves. And one of the few units here that I think is going to land themselves in a true B tier. Because they're just decent. You'll see them often enough, but they're not sort of... yeah, they're nowhere near a mandatory choice. Which does move us on to the Hammers. Hammers, honestly, not a bad infantry on paper. In practice, not great. D tier. I don't think they're terrible to the point of being an F. There are certainly builds where you can make these guys work. I think that if you bring enough crowd control, or if your opponent happens to not be bringing a crap ton of monsters or chariots, against certain factions, these guys can do you wonders. They actually are very competitive Grey Weapon infantry. They trade pretty efficiently to most Grey Weapons around their price range. But yeah, as Dwarves are usually not crutching hard on the melee stuff, so yeah, these guys just fall off. They're just too they're just expensive, and while hitting hard, you usually cannot afford. You can get a unit of Thunders and almost a unit of Dwarf Warriors for the price of a single unit of Hammers, and realistically Thunders plus. Or you can get like 2 Quarlers or units like that. You can for the price of a single unit of Hammers. And realistically, those missile units combined with cheaper chaff are going to net you more value in most games as the Dwarves. And unfortunately, that is going to hold these guys back to a D. Moving on to Ironbreakers. An okay unit. Not good, not terrible. Very good combat stats, very good in sustained combat. I'm going to give them a C tier. I think these guys have a little bit more of a niche in certain builds than against certain factions than Hammers do. The satchel charges on these guys can really melt enemy squishy troops. They can get rid of even decently elite enemy troops, and really allow Ironbreakers to win battles you wouldn't expect them to win otherwise. Actually, you know what? I'm going to give them a D tier because at the same time they are so expensive. So certainly a respectable unit. Don't get me wrong, but ultimately the high cost definitely holds these guys back. And yeah, certainly with satchel charges they can do great. But it's a very sort of niche situation. If you know what you're doing and you're going for a relatively narrow defensive build with dwarves, these guys can work. But it is a very specific circumstance where you can make them work. As much as I like Ironbreakers, I actually do like heavy Ironbreaker builds, but it is very niche. Something, for example, against greenskins, it can work pretty well because you can combine these guys with like some other weird units like throwing axes and get value against black orcs that way. Because you basically know that black orcs are coming against greenskins, and that makes Ironbreakers plus throwing hatchets a decent choice. But yeah, in most cases they're just too expensive. Just like hammers, the great unit on paper, but too expensive. Finally, Giant Slayers, the creme de la creme of anti-large infantry for the dwarves, but yeah, not the greatest. I'm going to give them a C tier because I don't think they're terrible. They're certainly not to snuff with normal Slayers because they're just too expensive, but they do hit very hard. They have AP, weapon strength. That's really all you need to know. Besides that, there are just more expensive Slayers with slightly worse defensive stats. But really the main selling point is just how hard they can hit against large. If you snare an opponent's monster or cavalry especially, these guys will mulch them in seconds. It's actually disgusting. And sort of needs to be censored out what these guys can do to elite cavalry. Especially, they will do insane amounts of damage. But still, being infantry, they are sort of restricted in keeping on top of your target. In some matchups, you just don't want to bother with these guys. They're just too expensive. Once again, you can get a unit of Thunderers and a unit of Dwarf Warriors for the price of these guys. And who are you going to get more value out of? Probably the 2-unit combo rather than Giant Slayers. Now moving on to Originalist of Renown, and here the dwarves have a lot to choose from. There are quite a few good choices here. Equine Miners, I think, are an easy A tier. I think there are some cases. These guys are miners with blasting charges who also have frenzy and extra ammo. Getting value out of that extra ammo can be difficult in certain cases. It takes a high level of micro and good deployment, plus an opponent who's perhaps not as good at sort of interrupting or interfering. Most likely you guys saw that these guys are actually used in some of my recent games against Yumi's. You guys saw on live stream. These guys performed rather well in Yumi's hands, but he is a really good dwarf player. So I think it does take a certain amount of micro and skill with positioning to properly get value out of these guys. And if you don't do that, the frenzy and base combat stats on these guys, the frenzy and rank 9 combat stats on these guys are just not going to compensate for how weak they are baseline, for how weak miners are baseline. And you're going to end up with essentially overpriced miners with blasting charges. And I don't think you really want that. So I think there are more circumstances where you will just want normal miners than Equine Miners. Next up, we do have the Warriors of Dragonfire Pass. These guys I don't think are great. I'm going to give them a C tier because I think there are a few circumstances. So these guys are basically budget longbeards, but as dwarves, you really want your main line to hold. And these guys don't hold as well as longbeards because they don't have immune psychology. And so that is very much a restriction. Certainly, they do have good combat stats against squishy infantry. And with the nerf to longbeards, they do now cost the same as longbeards. But in most cases, you're just going to want that improved staying power on longbeards, the better armor, the immunity psychology over the bonus versus infantry and fire damage on these guys. So I think they're going to net themselves a C tier. There are niche circumstances against swarmy, cheap chaff races like Skaven or whatever, where these guys can shine. But majority of the time, I think you're not going to bring them. These guys are not sort of priority choice. Which does bring us on to the Grumbling Guard. I almost said Dragon Slayers, but that's not true. They're actually... Yeah, there's a lot of infantry for the dwarves. Grumbling Guard used to be an easy S tier. It was like the staple dwarven infantry back in the days of Warhammer 1. But those days are long past. Nowadays, these guys are probably waffling somewhere between a C and D tier. I'm probably going to give them a D. They do have actually solid combat stats. But they do cost a decent chunk of change. Their Vigor aura is not as much of an improvement as it used to be. Back in the day, you could essentially keep your troops in tip-top shape, Vigor-wise, for the entirety of a battle. Now it's not going to do that. It's much less efficient. And these guys are kind of like unit of hammers that trades that support aura for sort of better and support aura and a better survivability for inferior combat or offensive stats. Hammers just hit a lot harder, and so ultimately these guys I think are just stuck at a D tier. They're souped up Longbeards, but where you will bring Longbeards a decent amount of the time, these guys just too expensive. Which does bring us on to the Dragonback Slayers. Dragonback Slayers, easy S tier. If you're going to bring Slayers, really almost any build you're going to see these guys. You'll even see them with their Vanguard builds because they can run up and join the main army relatively quick because they're Slayers. These guys, the main selling point on these guys is the fact that they have Snare. The power of the Dragonback makes this the only Dwarf unit. I'm trying to think, but yeah, they are the only Dwarf unit that's not a Hero Lord that's packing a Snare. And yeah, easy S tier because of that Snare. Besides that, they've got solid enough combat stats to really threaten large targets. They can mulch cavalry, infantry. They have built-in physical resist on top of their shield, the base sort of Slayer HP and shield. So they're not as squishy as normal Slayers, despite being more expensive. So so a lot of the downsides you would normally have to being a more if these guys didn't have the physical resist as well, it might be a little tougher to decide because they're still as squishy as Slayers basically, but cost so much more. But yeah, with the physical resist built in, with the Snare, these guys are just an easy S tier. Very, very strong infantry. Grumbling's Ironbreakers. If you're going to bring Ironbreakers, you're going to bring these guys. You will see them in a lot of builds as an anchor. There are a lot of videos you're going to see on YouTube of these guys holding on to the bitter end, fighting against insurmountable odds, and then still somehow clawing their way back and winning. They're a massive unit of Ironbreakers, essentially. They're a unit of Ironbreakers that is 90 models rather than the standard 75. Besides that, they also have Vanguard, so you can use them in Vanguard builds. You can use, and you'll basically see them in every Vanguard build. I think they're very popular just because they serve such a strong anchor. Besides that, they're souped up Ironbreakers, 82 melee defense, I believe, off the top of my head. Just insane. These guys can tank for days. Of course, satchel charges like every other Ironbreaker. But if you're going to bring one elite anchor infantry, it's going to be this. And really, this is part of the reason why a lot of these other elite Dwarven infantry fall off, because yeah, these guys are just the goat for the elite Dwarven infantry. And finally, we do have the Peak Gate Guard, and I think I actually did these out of order. Oh well, it's okay. Peak Gate Guard. These guys, I'm going to give them a C tier. They are better than normal hammers. The reason being, once again, if you're going to bring any hammer, you're going to bring these guys. They give you magic damage, which as dwarves is otherwise very difficult to come by. We've already discussed that in quite some depth. Great combat stats, armor sunring effect, which does synergize non-AP missiles and that sort of thing. So just all in all, honestly, a stellar great weapon unit if it wasn't for dwarves just sucking at getting good value out of melee infantry. So as it is, though, they are still such a strong unit that they get themselves a C tier, which, you know, is respectable. I would certainly keep in mind, guys, the fact that units are rated anything D and up is still competitive or usable. And these guys are definitely more than usable in C tier, but it's just that the Dwarven roster is so heavily carried by some of these units towards the top of the list that it's very hard to put these guys higher. Then we are on to missiles, and that's really the other Dwarven selling point: infantry and missiles. Maybe missiles are really more the selling point. Rangers. Now here the missiles, some of them are going to be rated lower than you might expect, and that's simply because there's a lot of competition. A lot of Dwarven missiles are very similar in function. So Rangers are going to net themselves an A tier. Reason is quite simple. Decent AP with the changes to crossbows. They have stock. They have shields. They don't have good armor, but it doesn't really matter because they still have shields and stock, which is a great source of survivability. Makes them survivable against enemy artillery play. Allows them to get the jump on, for example, Wood Elves, who will try to kite you with Way Watchers. These guys can potentially wait until the Way Watchers reveal themselves, close the distance, fire off a volley before the Way Watchers can juke out of range. That sort of thing. Certainly an easy A tier for these guys. But The reason they're not any higher is because they have some very stiff competition. And you're not going to see these guys in every build. Unlike these units, which you see in almost every build, you won't see these guys in almost every build. Because there's some stiff competition from a lot of these other missile units down below on the list. Next up, Quarlers. Quarlers are going to net themselves a B tier. I think they're not a terrible missile unit, don't get me wrong. But not up to snuff with the Rangers. But there are certain situations where armor trumps stock, and these guys against a faction such as Bretonnia, for example, where you might not care about stock, the fact that these guys can tank peasant bowman arrows much more effectively is valuable. Against a faction like Empire, the fact that you can tank crossbows bolts for a long period of time can be valuable if your opponent just does a massive shooting blow. Against high elves, kind of, you can get this benefit because against high elves they might bring archers, and you can kind of shoot back with these guys. So there are, and honestly, even against factions where you're concerned with them getting cheap backline harass units into the backline, Rangers will struggle a lot more than Quarlers will. Quarlers will often kick those cheapos interference units to the curb. A unit like Hounds, for example, will get crumped pretty hard by these guys because the difference between 80 armor and 40 is huge. That's 30% damage mitigation versus 60% on average. So that is a massive difference. Quarlers are taking almost half of what a Ranger is taking damage-wise from non-AP sources. So it's a big difference, and it can matter. Finally, we do have Quarles with great weapons. Now, this is a bit of an awkward unit. I have seen it used. I have had it used effectively against me, especially against Bretonnia, but I think they're a supremely niche unit regardless. Losing shields and getting more expensive for the sake of an AP melee weapon is just, on a missile unit, it's just not that valuable. Against factions that are going to go super heavy, hard in the paint with cavalry play, and you know they don't have other gimmicks, Bretonnia being a really prime example, means that these guys can perform okay. They have niches, but I think by and large you are better off with Quarlers or Rangers, or Bookmans Rangers once we get to them, than these guys. So, but there is a specific niche for that AP melee. Next up, we do have the Rangers with throwing axes, or Great Weapon Rangers. These guys are going to net themselves, I'm going to give them a C tier. The reason being that if you're going to do a Vanguard build with Dwarves, you are going to bring Rangers with great weapons. They are just a staple of those builds. You need some 8-point defense. Well, I say that. I don't want to give them a D tier because I love using these guys, but I gave Ironbreakers a D tier. I'm going to give these guys a D tier as well. They're a great unit, in my opinion, because the amount of burst AP damage they can do is insane. But short range, low projectile velocity hurts them a lot, makes them nearly useless against flyers, makes them very vulnerable to enemy counter battery fire. Any archery unit will outrange these guys. So even orcs and goblin archers will threaten these guys. They only have 40 armor because they're rangers, and their melee stats are just not that good. They're kind of like Quarles with great weapons, but with a short range AP attack instead of crossbow. I think I love them in the greenskin matchup to melt black orcs very, very fast. I have seen them used effectively. These guys are certainly not a non-competitive unit in the right circumstances, but in the majority of cases, you will prefer Thunders or Trollhammer Torpedoes or units like that to these guys. Which does get us onto Thunders, who are an easy S tier in my mind. They are the king of Dwarven AP infantry. You will see them in almost every matchup in some capacity. Usually, at least you'll see like a unit or two of Thunders. It might not be the entirety of your opponent's build, missile-wise. Oftentimes it will be, but Thunders are just a staple of the Dwarven roster. Can dish out really solid AP damage. They have shields. They have 80 armor. Yeah, and they're not that expensive. 700 gold is pretty darn affordable. So, easy S. Which does get us on to Bookmans Rangers. Great unit, easy A tier in my opinion, despite the nerfs they've suffered over the past few patches. They are more expensive now, but still they do hit pretty darn hard. They've got the new and improved crossbows, which do more AP damage. They have immune to psychology. They have regen. They have stock, of course, like any other ranger. Great melee stats. They'll kick, and they have charge defense against large. So they're a pretty insane unit. They're kind of like a strange side grade to Lothran Seaguard or something, or Shadow Warriors, but a very, very solid unit. And Great, especially in matchups like, well, honestly, there's a lot of matchups they're good in, but especially in a matchup like Wood Elves, these guys with their regen can really, regen and stalk, can really trade blow for blow with a lot of Wood Elf missile play, and can be very invaluable there. And then if your opponent tries to charge in with, say, Wild Riders, these guys, if they're braced, will actually soak up the charge okay. Not great, but they can soak it up. And they won't rout easily because of their immune to psychology, so easy A tier. But once again, they are competing with Vanilla Rangers and Quarlers, and in specific matchups with Quarrel Great Weapons, so it's just a very hotly contested role. There's 4 crossbow units on the Dwarf roster. It's tough to get a winner. Next up, we do have, oh, I completely forgot, and I feel bad now, but we do have Iron Drakes with the Flamethrower. This unit's actually decent nowadays. Ever since the explosive damage got reworked, they do a lot more damage. I still think it's a bit difficult to make them work. I'm going to give them a C tier, but this is certainly not a sort of an indictment of them being bad. They do have a leadership debuff associated with their attack, the burnt debuff. Explosive damage allows them to do insane amounts of work very, very quickly. They are pretty darn tanky, being iron breakers essentially with a flamethrower. So easy C tier. Just difficult to make use of, I think. But I think they are a little more forgiving or more generally useful than some of these units down here. As a point defense, high damage dealer, they're just solid. Trollhammer Torpedoes, the last on the list here, are going to net themselves a B tier. They're a great supplementary unit. You'll often see 1 or 2 units of these guys because they can delete large. There's no large unit that wants to get hit by Trollhammer Torpedoes because they will suffer a brutal and terrifying demise. These guys can do work. You get a single volley of these guys into, say, a Bretonnian Paladin, and the Paladin's basically dead. So it's insane what Trollhammer Torpedoes can do. But low missile velocity, and they're actually not bad against infantry either, because they do arc and they do have explosive damage. So, you know, they're not bad. I give them an easy B tier, because downside is short range and inaccuracy due to low projectile velocity, but still a very, very, very strong unit. And then we have the Regiments of Renown. Ulthar's Raiders, easy A tier in my opinion. Their debuff is very strong. You won't see them all the time. The short range is definitely still downside, and they are still a flimsy unit. But Marked by Ulthar is a stellar debuff, makes an opponent's unit much more vulnerable to missile attacks. That's all there is to say, really, but that's a huge benefit. Makes these guys great for synergizing with other Dwarven missile play. Just lets you delete a key target very, very fast. So easy A tier for these guys. That's really the reason they're A tier, is just because of their ability. Without Marked by Ulthar, these guys, I guess they are a Veterancy 9 Ranger with great weapons, but really without Marked by Ulthar, they'd just be probably like a C or D tier. But Marked by Ulthar single-handedly bumps them to A. And then we have the Skolder Guard, who are unfortunately an F tier. I really want to love these guys. They look awesome. Their attacks are awesome. They're firing like steam from their guns. But really, especially with the explosive buff to normal Iron Drakes, these guys don't really have a niche. They don't beat armored infantry and really any better than Iron Drakes do or Trollhammers do. They're more expensive than both. They are a little tankier than both, but it doesn't matter. They're just too expensive, too easy to shut down. Unfortunately, an F tier. And yeah, then on to artillery. So, Bolt Thrower, this is a unit I'm not supremely fond of, but I know a lot of people love it and swear by it. I'm going to give it a... Oh, it's a tough one. B to C. I'm going to give it a B tier because I'm feeling generous today. Bolt Thrower, dirt cheap, can do some anti-artillery unit or anti-artillery work, has very short range at 340, which is terrible by Dwarven standards. Actually terrible by general artillery standards. There isn't a single artillery piece in the game, true artillery piece in the game, that this unit outranges. So that's definitely a downside. But it is a dirt cheap poke option. It can poke away at elite enemy infantry because it does have a little bit of pierce. It can poke away at enemy cav, can poke away at enemy single entities. It's just a nice supplementary unit, much like the Trollhammer, and you can bring a lot of them because they only cost 550. Cannon, easy S. Dwarves can't afford, as we discussed before, Dwarves cannot afford to lose the artillery game. They must, if they are going to play static, they must win the artillery game. Cannon allows you to win the artillery game. So against any faction that has artillery of its own, you basically have to bring cannons unless you're going to Vanguard into their face. And against a lot of factions, that's not smart. And yeah, so easy S tier, you have to bring cannons. Plus, they give you a great way to chip down enemy on most maps. Obviously, if it's a forested map, you're probably going to bring Gyrocopters, who are great in their own right. But you're going to bring cannons a lot. They can counter battery, they can wreck enemy cavalry, do some decent damage to enemy infantry, and yeah, they're just solid overall. Grudge Throwers, who I completely skipped over, are probably going to net themselves... Probably give them a D tier. They're not absolutely useless, but catapults in this game generally kind of struggle. And Dwarven Artillery... So, if you're going to play artillery heavy as dwarves, you always have to bring a cannon or multiple cannons to ensure you win the artillery duel so that you can actually play static. So, essentially, if you're bringing Grudge Thrower, on top of that, there is going to be the added penalty of having to bring a cannon to counter battery. And, well, that might not be a serious concern in the eyes of some. I think it is a serious downside. And, it's actually one of the reasons that both the organ gun and flame cannon are going to be a bit lower on this list, is because they can't counter battery enemy artillery, and they're too expensive to sort of just lose trying to push into range like a bolt thrower. So that really holds the Grudge Thrower back. Organ gun, decent unit, actually really good against, great supplementary artillery piece, great at deleting enemy cavalry, decent against, actually great against infantry and enemy shooting. Decent against single entities at like a short point blank range. That's itself a B tier. 300 range means it's not terrible. It can certainly engage targets further away than they can shoot back for the most part. It does have some spread, which may or may not be a boon. Can certainly help in some cases. You can, for example, even against Wood Elves, that can be decent because you can shoot down Way Watchers before they can get in range. If you got, especially if you have Rangers scouting and covering for you, or Miners or whatever. So. Definitely a bit of a niche unit. Once again, you need those cannons usually to provide that anti-artillery support, but a unit that can certainly dish out a lot of hurt very quickly to multi-model units. Flame cannon, I think D tier is generous, but I'm going to give it a D tier because I gave the Grudge Thrower a D tier. I don't think these two are so bad they're F tier. That's really the main reason they're... where I would say everything here is like a higher D, these guys are like a low D. And, oh yeah, Flame Cannon is amazing against infantry, and that's about it. It doesn't do much to just anything else, really. Projectiles are very slow, so dodgeable. Range is not great. You absolutely have to, even on smaller maps, you have to bring cannons to counter battery. Probably even on something like Kelp and Coal Dust, because the range is just so terrible on Flame Cannons. They do counter enemy archers pretty well, but they cost a lot of money, so it's difficult to justify these guys. The fact that you have to bring cannons to escort them, it's jacking up your price. You bring a single flame cannon, and now you have to invest in 1 or 2 cannons to cover that flame cannon and ensure that you don't just lose that artillery duel and lose your flame cannon for nothing. And it's very difficult, very, very difficult to justify this unit. Finally, the Goblobber, Regiment of Renown, Grudge Thrower, actually a very good unit in my opinion, and not up to snuff with the cannon, but still a very good unit. A tier. It can win you artillery duels with its insane leadership debuff. It does discouraged plus penalty for being under artillery attack. Anything that's not high elf or dark elf artillery, but their insane leadership values, or other dwarves, I guess, is going to rout quick under fire from Goblobber, because you're taking the, I think it's -8 or -10 leadership for being under artillery fire, an extra -16 for discouraged. Stack that on some damage being done, and you will see Empire, Goblin and Bretonnian artillery would just turn tail and run basically on first hit, and a lot of other artillery will buckle within seconds. So just a very, very good unit at counter battery, very precise, so it can snipe away at enemy infantry, and fairly cheap. So, and plus discouraged effect, even if you're fighting infantry, it can help break them faster. So, you know, it's a good unit overall. For the flyers, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Certainly, some of them have come a long way, some of them less so. Gyrocopter with steam gun. In my opinion, C tier. It's good at a very specific purpose, melting squishy infantry. I think on specific maps where you cannot, how do I put this? On specific maps where you are worried about getting your opponent getting quick surround, and perhaps you can't get the proper coverage you'd like, especially on like heavily forested maps, where it might be difficult to get an early beat on your opponent. Gyrocopters can be decent. Just 1 or 2 of them. Sort of, yeah, maybe D tier. So I think I'll put them at D, because there are specific niches where these guys do great. Against nasty skulkers, against orcs, they're a very solid unit. They'll do great. Against like beastmen, they can mess up their squishy trash. They can actually zone away harpies a little bit if they work in tandem in teams, because one gyro can soak hits while the other one steams them to death. Generally, though, you do want gyros working in conjunction with ground forces. Though you want your ground forces covering your gyros, all the gyros cover the ground forces. So, but Yeah, these guys are very niche, but functional. Gyrocopter with Brimstone, great unit. I'm going to give it an A tier, leaning towards even S, but I'm going to give it an A. Can do decent damage to infantry, insane damage to large, especially for a unit that's very difficult to shut down. Some factions have basically no functional counter to Brimstone guns. Certainly no cost-effective counter, because these guys don't cost a lot of gold. They're only 800 gold off the top of my head, so yeah, not great. For a lot of factions struggle to cost-effectively counter Brimstone guns, especially if it's a faction like Norska or Chaos, who only have Manticores and more expensive monsters to counter flyers. It can be very easy for the Dawi to just be a pain in the rear. Gyros in general are hard to shut down for short-ranged or non-AP missiles or arcing missiles, because there's only 3 models. They tend to stagger, tend to juke out of the way. So while a faction like Empire or Vampire Coast obviously won't give a crap because they'll shoot you down with guns, most other factions will struggle, and it nets these guys an A. Then the Gyro Bomber. Vanilla Gyro Bomber kind of depends a little bit if you're willing to micro like God. I'm going to give it a D tier because I think this guy is even worse. If you're willing to micro like a God, Gyro Bomber can get some value with the bombs. The biggest downside really to the Gyro Bomber is the bomb targeting array. It's way too micro taxing to get great value out of bombs. Besides that, it can do some okay damage to single targets, so certainly not up to snuff with Brimstone guns. This unit is probably leaning towards F in my mind, but I'm certainly open to being proven wrong. Yeah, just not great. And the Skyhammer is an F tier because you're paying even more for a Gyro Bomber that's not really much better. And a lot of the buffs just don't matter. None of these units are great in melee. Obviously, Gyrocopters, if all you're fighting is infantry, as you guys probably saw in some recent replay or some recent gameplay, Gyrocopters can cycle charge infantry pretty well if it's a depleted force. But Gyrocopters are certainly not great in sustained combat. Gyro Bombers even worse, and they certainly do struggle a good bit. So really their only purpose is doing damage, and doing damage with such a micro-intensive unit is frustrating as all heck. You have to time the bomb drops, try not to bomb your own troops. It's just very frustrating and very difficult to justify. So that's my 2 cents there. So that is it for my Dwarven. That is it for my Dwarven Dwarven tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys found it interesting. And if you have your own comments, remarks, critiques, feel free to fill them in. Like I said, I don't consider anything a D tier or above to be non-competitive. I think these F tier units are pretty fair. They're just terrible, but I think anything D and higher is certainly usable. I do think we see a lot of those crush units showing up here at S tier, especially for the Dwarves. They're a faction that very much revolves around specific units. But you can certainly make other units work. The roster is not without merit for other units. The biggest problem is, of course, Lords and Heroes, where you really don't have many options. But that is my 2 cents there. Hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely looking forward to see. I know there's a lot of Dawi mains who follow the channels or Dawi lovers, so certainly going to be looking forward to see what you guys have to say. If you agree with this tier list, do you think it's accurate or not? Do you think Dwarves are in a bad spot the way I think they are? I feel like Dwarves are in a bad spot balance-wise, where they're competitive but limited in scope. Do you guys feel that way? Do you not agree? Am I just off there? Fill me in. Let me know what you guys are thinking, and I'll be sure to respond as soon as I can. Do thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.